Her name appears once in Genesis, pressed into the most violent genealogy in Scripture, and then the text walks away. Genesis 4:22. Naamah, daughter of Lamech the Canaanite, sister of Tubal-Cain, born from the line that gave humanity forged metal and the first recorded war song. The text gives her a name, positions her inside a genealogy saturated with blood and innovation, and offers nothing else. No death, no descendants, no explanation for why she merited naming when dozens of women in the same chapters did not. That silence has the texture of a decision, because somewhere outside the canon, in Sefer-Ha-Yashar, in Rabbinic tradition, in the material that didn't survive the editorial process intact, her name reappears, not as a footnote, as Noah's wife, the woman on the ark, the woman who carried humanity's second beginning inside her body. If those traditions are accurate, the flood didn't end the Cainite line, it preserved it, sealed inside the vessel God commissioned, alongside the man the text calls righteous in his generations. That's not a minor detail to absorb and move on from. That's a structural problem sitting at the center of the narrative. The record doesn't explain how both things can be true at once. It doesn't try. The name Naamah doesn't disappear quietly. It disappears at exactly the right moment, after it has been placed, positioned, and attached to a genealogy so specific that its absence from everything that follows cannot be accidental. Genesis 4 closes. The Cainite line ends. And Naamah, daughter of the man who sang about killing, sister of the man who taught humanity to work metal, she simply stops appearing. No death recorded, no descendants listed, no explanation offered for why a named woman receives no further mention in a text that tracks lineages with near-bureaucratic precision. The Bible does not state this plainly, but what it does not do is close the record. What it does is leave the ledger open. One name written down, nothing written after it, in a text that elsewhere accounts for every generation with dates, ages, and descendants. That open ledger is where the extra-canonical traditions step in. Sefer-Ha-Yashar, the Midrash traditions, certain rabbinic commentaries. These sources do not treat Naamah as a loose thread. They treat her as an answer. They name her. They place her. And what they say about where she ended up is the detail the canonical record, whether by policy or by pressure, chose not to carry forward. The suppressed texts knew exactly who was on that boat. The texts that preserved Naamah's name are not obscure. Sefer-Ha-Yashar, the Book of Jubilees, specific strands of rabbinic midrash. These are sources with documented transmission histories, copied and studied across centuries. They did not invent the identification. They recorded it. And what they recorded is this: the woman who entered the ark with Noah, who survived the flood that erased every other living thing, bore the name of the Cainite daughter, positioned in Genesis 4:22, inside the most violent genealogy in Scripture. To be precise, no canonical verse confirms this identification. What the canonical text does is leave the gap exactly where this argument requires one. Noah's wife has no name in Genesis. None. The text that names everyone else, that tracks Sethite genealogy with the precision of a legal record, goes silent on the one woman whose lineage would matter most to the story's theology. That silence deserves more than a footnote. The objection worth raising directly is this: these are late sources, post-biblical, shaped by traditions that carry their own theological weight. It is a reasonable objection. Here is what it does not account for. The identification appears across sources that did not share editorial oversight, in traditions that had no particular reason to harmonize, preserving a name the canon had already chosen not to speak. 3 civilizations will say it differently, and yet what they say is not different. The extra-canonical traditions that preserved Naamah's name did not emerge from a single tradition. They surfaced across cultures that had no documented contact with each other. And they surfaced describing the same woman in structurally identical terms. Midrash Rabbah and the later rabbinic sources are the densest record. They name her explicitly, trace her lineage back to Cain, and, this is the detail that tends to disappear in summary, associate her with practices that the priestly tradition considered corrupting. The rabbis who preserved her name also preserved the reason she was dangerous. They wrote it down carefully, with the specificity of a legal document, not a legend. The Mesopotamian traditions are briefer, but the figure of the flood survivor's wife, connected by lineage to the metallurgical and musical arts, appears in Sumerian fragments before the Hebrew texts reach their current form. 1 civilization, fewer words, same architecture. And then there is the Irish mythological cycle, distant enough to dissolve any argument about shared scribal tradition, where the woman who crosses the great water carries knowledge that should not have survived the crossing. The pattern is not proof, but it is a question that deserves an answer no one has given. If the bloodline of Cain survived the flood inside the ark, what does that change about everything you were told the flood was supposed to accomplish? Leave that answer below. Here is what the convergence actually requires you to sit with. 3 separate textual traditions: Rabbinic, Syriac Christian, and strands of the wider Near Eastern mythological record, arrived at Naamah through different routes in different centuries, with no documented borrowing between them. That is not a coincidence you can dismiss in a footnote. The pattern is not proof, but it is a question that deserves an answer no one has given. And what the question exposes is this: every tradition that preserved her name also preserved her lineage. Not just the name Naamah, the name Naamah with Cain attached. The 2 pieces traveled together. Strip one and you lose the other. The canonical record is incomplete by design. What is missing from it is not missing by accident. This is not in the canon. It is in the texts the canon chose not to include. And the reason that matters is not academic. It is structural. Because if the identification holds, for then the flood did not accomplish what the flood was supposed to accomplish. Something came through on the ark that the water was never meant to carry. If the bloodline of Cain survived inside the ark, what does that change about everything you were told the flood was supposed to erase? What the flood was designed to eliminate, Naamah carried through it. That is the uncomfortable arithmetic at the center of this argument. The divine judgment described in Genesis 6 targets contamination, genetic, cultural, spiritual, the lineage of the Watchers, the knowledge passed down through violence and metallurgy, the bloodline that produced Tubal Cain. And then Noah boards the ark with a woman whose name, in every extra-canonical source that bothered to preserve it, traces directly back to that line. So honesty requires saying this plainly. No canonical verse confirms this identification. What the canonical record does is refuse to name Noah's wife at all, and that refusal, positioned exactly where a genealogical clarification would ordinarily appear, has a shape to it. Matthew 24:37 frames what follows the flood as precedent, not conclusion. As it was in the days of Noah, so will it be at the coming of the Son of Man. The text does not say the days of Noah were a clean beginning. It says they are a pattern that repeats. If Naamah's line survived, if the knowledge, the bloodline, the cultural inheritance of Cain crossed the water inside the ark, then the flood did not reset the equation. It preserved it. What Naamah carried through the flood was not an accident of poor record-keeping. It was a structural problem that the official tradition chose to stop asking about rather than answer. The line that should have been erased survived inside the vessel built to erase it. That is the problem the canon leaves open and then quietly closes with harmonization, redefinition, and the patient replacement of a name with a designation so generic that no one thinks to question it. And that pattern does not end with the flood. The next video follows one name, a name that surfaces on the other side of the flood, attached to a genealogy that should not exist, carrying a cultural signature that was supposed to be underwater. Where that name appears, what it builds, and which tradition finally identifies it by its original lineage. None of that is in the texts you were given in Sunday school. If the bloodline of Cain walked off the ark, the question is not whether the flood failed. The question is whether it was ever meant to finish what it started. That is the problem the next video opens. Subscribe now, because that answer changes the shape of everything that follows it.